Welcome back. David Hertel in for Elias. Well, according to this year's edition of the Ipsos LGBTQ Pride Report, which polled adults in 26 countries, support for queer rights has decreased across the globe since 2021. Several metrics suggest the starkest changes occurred right here in Canada. So to help us explain the causes of this decline, I'm happy to be joined this morning by Adam Zivo, National Post columnist and the director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy. Adam, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So what's going on? These are very surprising numbers to me.
Well, so there's been a significant decline in support for LGBTQ rights, and that's something that we've had some sense of over the past 2 years, given the increase in anti-LGBTQ protests, given the increase in anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. But this is the first time that we've seen this quantified in Canada over the past 2 years. And so across the board, we see about a 10 to 15% decline in support for LGBTQ rights, both in terms of visibility and support for legal rights. So, for example, I think about 10% fewer people support seeing out gay athletes. Much fewer people now want to see more LGBTQ characters on TV screens. There's less support for LGBTQ inclusive anti-discrimination laws, which provide equal access to employment and housing. On the whole, it's really concerning. But what I argued in my column is it's actually an extension of a trend that we saw starting all the way back in the mid-2010s.
And speaking to that trend, I mean, the obvious first reflex to explain this decline would be the rise of right-wing social conservatism rather. Yet you're suggesting it's much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is that, yes, right-wing social conservatism does drive this trend, but what drives the popularity behind this conservatism? There's an interplay here. And so what I would argue is that LGBTQ activists have misplayed their hands over the past 10 years. And I want to stress that I myself am a gay activist. You know, this upcoming week, I'll be launching a new mural at Pride Toronto on, Taiwanese pride. I used to have my own LGBTQ activist campaign in the late 2010s. I've witnessed this firsthand. And for many decades, LGBTQ activists were very focused on building bridges with the rest of society, on stressing what they have in common with other people throughout the 90s and 2000s especially. There was a strong focus on, well, someone who you know might be gay, a relative or a friend. There was this strategic rebranding of gay marriage as marriage equality. When men were dying of AIDS and being abandoned by their families, you had the AIDS quilt, which humanized them.
True.
And then, interestingly enough, when same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015 across all of the United States, many of the more conventional and institutionally minded LGBTQ activists retreated from activism because they had won their ultimate symbol of legitimacy. And the people who remained were more marginalized, more militant, more abrasive, and they dramatically changed the tone and character of LGBTQ activism, became much more alienating and aggressive. And starting from around 2016, we start to see declining support. So I think that is the fundamental problem here, and that the queer community needs to pivot.
Give me some concrete examples of what you would call like radical activism. What is turning the mainstream off LGBTQ causes right now?
Well, so you can divide it in terms of tone and in terms of policy proposals. So when it comes to tone, we know that in the mid-2010s, and then especially in the late 2010s, you had the rise of this kind of style of activism where people really emphasized the hierarchy of identities, right? And if you weren't LGBTQ, your voice was seen as completely useless, and that there was no need to persuade you. You had LGBTQ activists saying that it's not their job to educate you, and they wanted to be compensated for the emotional labor of explaining LGBTQ inclusive ideas to other people. I use a religious comparison, whereas activists used to be like humble preachers in the town square preaching to anyone. Their attitude shifted so that they were almost like high priests guarding a scripture, and that they sort of saw as giving them social capital, and that's unproductive. Now, the tone is one aspect, The other aspect here is policy. So same-sex marriage is pretty easy to sell because it doesn't really interfere with other people. You can really easily justify it under like a liberal conception of social justice, where you have equality under the law and mutual rights. Some of the more recent policy proposals, for example, let's say trans inclusion in sports without any limitations, or particularly like some forms of gender affirming care for youth without proper guardrails, are a harder sell, and there are legitimate conversations to be had about that, while at the same time respecting the dignity of trans people. But rather than have those conversations and try to balance competing rights, people were basically told to shut up.
Right.
And over time, we saw that didn't work, and now there's that resentment that's coming out quite volcanically.
Do you sense that in the movement, the leaders of the movement are hearing this, are understanding this? Do you sense that there is some sort of shift happening, or is it falling on deaf ears?
Yes and no. So what I would say is that LGBTQ activist leaders, for the most part, tend to be quite radical. They're radical leftists, and that's always been true. And they control all of the queer institutions. They receive all of the government funding, and they're not reflective of the full ideological diversity of the queer community. There are all sorts of different people of different political beliefs who are gay, lesbian, trans, and only one segment is reflected. And that radical segment, I don't think, is ready to hear the fact that you can talk to people who don't always agree with you, and that doesn't mean that they're fascists or Nazis. Now, because there are many of the more, I guess, like normie types within the LGBTQ community who are seeing this backlash and who are concerned about it, many of them are now more openly expressing frustration with these activists. So you're seeing a schism where the normies are saying we actually have to turn away from this, and we have to go back to our earlier principles, otherwise we will lose our rights.
Because what I'm seeing, just generally speaking, with several what I would call far left causes, is the same tone, and you're seeing in the polling, just generally speaking, what you would call the center is disappearing, and some people that would be willing to espouse these causes are being turned off and heading towards the right side of the spectrum. Do you see that as well?
Yes, I mean, look, I'm an example of that. When I was younger, I identified with the center left, and I found it very difficult to operate in that space because if you weren't left enough, you were ostracized, and people would smear you and say all sorts of horrible things to you. I remember being called a racist because I believed that police should be in pride festivals, because it's important to foster connections between the LGBTQ community and a very powerful institution that has a lot of influence. And just supporting that was considered like just necessarily racist. And so over time, I drifted into the center right, where I currently identify, and I know that there are many other people who have made that same shift. And it's much easier to be in that space. I find like the center left is perhaps the most harassed segment of this, I guess, woke culture that so harshly polices people's ideological purity.
Unfortunately, I totally agree with that statement, Adam. That's all the time I have. Appreciate your insights as always. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Adam Zivo, National Post columnist and the director of the Center for Responsible Drug Policy.